Thanks, James. And I can remove the sticky that says hit record, since I usually start recording about the third slide myself. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm Matt Perkins. I'm a program director in LISC's National Safety and Justice program. Have been a crime prevention through environmental design here after Septet practitioner for about 25 years. And so wanted to give you a brief overview of the principles of Septet and some of the larger directions of Septet work over the past 20 or 25 years before turning things over to Tom, who can talk a little bit more about the school environment in Septet. And the title you'll see on the page is Place-Based Strategies for School Safety within a Community Context. And I want you to stick a pin in the community context part, because it's really a central feature of what I'm going to talk about in terms of kind of the evolution of Septet. And as a reminder, as we get started, this project is supported through the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention at the Office of Justice Programs, U.S. Department of Justice, and the findings, conclusions, opinions, and recommendations expressed here today are those of the speakers and not of DOJ itself necessarily. And just a reflection on the goals for the CYVP program, Community-Based Youth Violence Prevention Program, reducing the incidence of school violence, responding to victimization, exposure to violence and trauma, improving school safety and climate, and prevention of violence, delinquency, and victimization. And in pursuit of those goals, we're going to talk today about Septet principles, the opportunities to use those principles to assess and prioritize physical parts of the school and surrounding areas that may impact violence and victimization, and opportunities to collaboratively and collectively use these principles. And so to start at a high level and introduce the topic and bring these principles into place, just want to talk a little bit about where Septet comes from. And really, it's based on the theories that one finds in situational crime prevention, as represented by the crime triangle on the right of your screen. Much of the work we do in promoting safety and within the criminal justice system focuses on the people involved, either as victims or as offenders, even though those people are often the same individuals, just on different days. Situational crime prevention, though, tries to remind us that for any event to take place, three elements really need to be in place. We do need that target or victim. We do need the person who will act as an offender in that instance, but also there needs to be an environment in which it can take place. And we've been able to make great strides in research around the nexus between place and crime over the past 30 to 40 years, right? Among the things that we found are the myths of displacement. Probably the biggest struggle for me, especially in doing community-based crime prevention over my career, has been the sentiment that, well, if crime goes away here, it just goes somewhere else. And what we find actually is if you remove that spatial environmental leg of the crime triangle, we know that most of the crime in a space that goes away completely. It doesn't just move to another place. There's some research that's a little more nuanced, right? But it's something that makes sense to us, in that certain types of crime will move. Those that are have a greater motivation behind them, and you think of something like a heroin user, the market at which they get drugs disappears, they're going to go somewhere else to find, right? But lots of types of crime, things like youth running into each other and having an argument and getting into a fight. You remove that spatial element where they don't run into each other at the same place, that never happens then. In fact, what we see is that when we make physical spaces better, there's a diffusion of benefits. So the places around it get better as well. And that crime prevention through environmental design can be a really important tool in impacting places. And a lot of people, when they think of Septet, think about crime prevention through environmental design in terms of the strategies that are used to impact place. So that's the lighting strategy, or that's the fencing strategy, or that's the camera strategy. And in my experience of working with people doing Septet interventions, what we have to do is make sure that we focus on the principles instead of the tools, because when we focus on the tools, we can really miss the mark. And also, I will say that Septet is best used and should be used as a problem-solving tool. So what works in another place may not work for you. You have to make sure you're trying to address the same problem and think about what the unintended consequences of Septet interventions can be. But when we let the principles guide us, that goes a long way toward making sure we have successful interventions. And the top three principles listed here are generally accepted: surveillance or natural surveillance, which is not somebody watching, but also the ability to see and be seen, and to use our allies around us and the community around us as allies to help make our places safer. Access control, which can be about letting in people who are allowed to be in the space and keeping out others, but it's also more influential measures like wayfinding is a big element of access control. How do we get people to move in the way we want to, even though there's not potentially physical barriers? And territoriality, setting that message about, is this a space for an individual to be in, and what are the spaces, what are the appropriate spaces for different members of the community to be in. I've added a couple which I find to be just as important. Image and maintenance, what really goes along with the territoriality, but keeping in mind that everything that you see in an area contributes to the impressions that users are getting of the space. Capable guardianship, trying to present the message that somebody is in charge of a place and that a place is being watched by the community. And then policies and practice, especially for institutional areas like schools, school grounds. How do you build in that capable guardianship and maintenance into your policies and practice, and making sure that everyday work contributes to the success of Septet interventions. When we talk about Septet, we have to keep in mind, right, the ultimate in Septet technology, right, where everybody can see and be seen, where where access to every space is controlled, right, where territoriality is defined in every way. It's good for control, but it's not necessarily good for community life. And so I asked you to stick a pin in that community context part of place-based interventions, to really talk about how Septet has evolved since the early 90s, when I was starting to work in the field. And the initial focus of a lot of Septet efforts, a lot of my work was done in the mid-90s in public housing complexes, was in creating spaces where nothing bad could happen. And to do that, you created sterile spaces. Well, right, nothing can happen, nothing bad can happen, but also nothing good can happen. So you have these great assets within a community that were not able to be used to build community, right? So what we want to do for the community context, because of what we're learning about the importance of community intervention, community buy-in, and community partnerships, is how do we use Septet as a way to promote positive uses of spaces, promote community building, and create those allies within the community for the spaces that we want to get better or to stay good. And the picture on the right is not from the mid-90s, but reminds me of working in Hoboken, New Jersey, before Hoboken got all fancy. And We were working in a high-rise building. It was mostly elderly, some disabled residents. But every day, the retired gentleman would come out, set up folding tables on the sidewalk, and play dominoes for essentially the whole day, a rotating cast of players and onlookers. And I remember going to work in the space and having the security guards tell us, oh, we'll get rid of these guys. We have to shoo them off every day. And we were like, why would you want these guys to leave? They live there. They're out on the sidewalk. They're keeping an eye on everybody who walks down the street, talking to them, letting everybody know that the space is being watched, that they are guardians of the space, and that while they may not have official status, they are looking out for the community, and the community is being watched. And so making sure that you recognize who the assets in your community are and who fills those informal, capable guardianship roles, and using them to your advantage. Again, so how do we move Septet from creating sterile spaces to building community, which is called second generation Septet, and making sure that we recognize legitimate uses and encourage them as a way to build collective efficacy and social cohesion. And if you're not familiar with those terms, coming out of criminological research and sociological research, we find that when collective efficacy and social cohesion are higher, crime is lower, all other things being equal. Collective efficacy essentially is, do I trust my neighbors? One way we measure that is by asking, if you were in trouble, would your neighbors pick up the phone and call for help for you? Social cohesion, do I use the resources within my community? So do I go to the local library? Do I go to the local park? And again, when we find that these sentiments are higher, we know that crime will be lower in the neighborhood. So how do we activate that block by block? Also understanding that legitimacy, right? When we take into account the values of the people affected by rules, is a very powerful finding. If you go back and think about, well, what we know is that if people feel they're included in the process, they buy into it more, and if they're not, then they tend to disregard rules and requests for cooperation. And going back, also, many of you will be familiar with broken windows. The idea that we can come in from outside and focus on small incivilities and enforce small laws and create an environment where people behave because there's no broken windows or litter or whatever in the neighborhood that would otherwise encourage lawbreakers to set up shop there. What we found is that actually that doesn't work when you come in from outside. And there was a fatal flaw in the original study that supported broken windows. And that was, the original study took place in a subway system, right? Not in a neighborhood. Nobody lived there. Very few people live there. So the study that would show NYPD could come in and pursue a strategy like this and crime would go down was based on a place where NYPD did not have the community to replace, right? There's no way in a community in which people live and work and study and visit 24/7, you can have an outside force come in and just replace what's already in the community. And again, the focus on crime prevention through environmental design as a way to solve problems in a neighborhood. And just some examples of those principles. Surveillability, a lot of people will focus on natural surveillance, right? Who sees, who can be seen. Eyes on the street are allies to you, and you can be allies to people walking down your street as well. When we try to put in lights or CCTV to replace that natural surveillance, it's because of the absence of the people, right? So it's a poor substitute for being able to use community members and allies as a way to keep an eye on each other. And just from a Septet standpoint, what does that look like? You see Bryant Park in the 1980s in New York City. on the left and today. So in the 1980s, it was considered a place that wasn't safe, that you didn't go to. And you can see that to the left picture, there's a vision between the street, which would be to the far left of the photos, and the pathway was not possible because of the high brush and the low branches on the trees. Also, the park area in the middle, the grassy part in the middle, was somewhere it'd be easy for somebody to hide. And so if you're walking through there, you're not going to feel comfortable. And if you take out those just barriers to the visual field and open up the space, you don't have to get rid of trees, right? You can just trim the trees. You don't have to get rid of shrubbery. You can just trim it down. But when you open up the space and people can see across the field and out to the street, it creates a completely different environment. Again, going back to the principles, it's important to remember that trimming trees is not just about trimming trees, it's about the principle of surveyability. This is a picture taken from Worcester, Massachusetts, where they actually did a good job of trimming the trees up from the base of the tree to a pretty high height, about 8 feet, but it didn't follow the nap of the road, the nap of the earth. So at the end of the block in the picture on the left is the main street, actually Main. And while the trees were trimmed up, they weren't trimmed up high enough to account for the curvature of the street. So you couldn't see up to the end of the block, which really limited the ability of folks to see or be seen to really about a half block area. And things like, how do you account for, on the picture of the right, the built-in porch and everything. And actually that porch on the right happened to be a place where a lot of things happened just because it wasn't visible from the street, from the main street, or even from most of the sidewalk on the side street. Another thing to think about, access control, who belongs where, and how do we give the impression of what is an appropriate activity. And I wanted to especially call out today the idea that when we think about placemaking and access control in physical spaces, and it's important to remember that a physical space is different depending on the time and context in which it's being used. And so you see a walking school bus or ride to school events, like those completely change the nature of the space. So when you're thinking about how do I impact a space, it can depend entirely on the time that you're thinking of it being used, right? But always try and remember, what is that space like in the times that I'm not thinking of? Again, access control and placemaking doesn't have to be about setting barriers up. It doesn't have to be about saying you cannot do this. This picture comes from Providence, Rhode Island. It's the playground outside the daycare center. And I love this sign because it wasn't a stay out, right? Private property, no one allowed. It's an invitation to the people in the neighborhood and people in the surrounding areas to be part of creating a safe and inviting space for children. And it's bilingual, right? Recognizing that a lot of the residents of the neighborhood are going to be more comfortable reading this message in Spanish. And again, it's a way to invite them in as partners in creating safe spaces. Again, access control, wayfinding, right? When we want to remove the excuse of somebody maybe being in a place they really shouldn't be in or doing things that we don't want them to do, let's remove those excuses. I know for me, often going to community events, community resources offices, or even schools, you can spend a lot of time just milling about trying to figure out, where do I go? Well, this also in Providence has removed completely the excuse of anybody who's going to say, well, I was looking for the office and couldn't find it, right? Because this lets you know exactly where it is and where to go. Territoriality, being able to express that somebody is in charge of a neighborhood. This picture is from Philadelphia, represents the work of the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society. There is a long time gap between these pictures, but what you see is an abandoned lot that had a lot of litter. on it. And the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society has a program where they clean and green lots and put up ornamental fencing. And what we found is that after these interventions by the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, violent crime and crime in general goes down at these lots. And also that, again, diffusion of benefit, we find that crime goes down in the areas surrounding them. And again, like this fence is not keeping any able-bodied person out, but it does send the message that these spaces are not open access. They're there for people to use, but it's a semi-private place. And really territoriality in the transition of space, we're talking about public areas like streets and sidewalks, semi-public, so the area between the sidewalk and this fence, for example, in the picture on the right. Semi-private would be inside the fence, or if you think about your lawn inside a hedgerow, and then private is a school or an apartment building or a house, right? And so the barriers to demonstrate these different segments of space send those messages, and sometimes it can be just very symbolic. Right? And so how do we keep that message maintained and set? And then the idea of capable guardianship really goes around maintenance in many ways. And the picture on the left is a tot lot, kids park on the left. It's difficult to see, but there's a empty cigarette box. There are also liquor bottles. And if you go to this park with your kids and see empty cigarette boxes and empty liquor bottles, beer bottles and lighters, you don't feel that this is a place for you, right? So being important, so it's important that we remember that it's an ongoing process to present images of capable guardianship, because when we go to a neighborhood, for example, the picture on the right, and see furniture out on the sidewalk and it's not trash day, we see, it's difficult to see in this photo, but fences in disrepair. This sends a message that people really aren't watching out for this street segment or this block, and maybe this is the place for you if you want to hang out or get into issues, get into things you shouldn't get into or don't want to get into on your home street. And finally, I just want to talk about, Tom will be getting into this much more, right? Like tactical urbanism and placemaking and how you can do this stuff quickly and cheaply. But things like managing traffic flow, right, can be done in many ways. You can create pinch points. That's really effective way to modify the physical environment and direct traffic, but it doesn't always have to be through hard infrastructure, right? You can take the first steps by doing things in a way that relies on the symbolism of and the visual images that you get from putting down paint, for example, in place of a pinch point before you can put in the hard infrastructure. And so thinking about how do we do this, and also using those changes as a way to organize the community around change and bringing people out as part of the process to design and implement and create safer spaces. And so hopefully you'll keep these principles in mind, and that's a little bit of an introduction to the topic. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tom Wyatt. I'm not going to read all this. We'll just say that at LISC, we've been working with Tom for about 8-9 years now. He's done all sorts of Septet-like and place-based interventions in Michigan and across the country, and has a lot of expertise in how you can do this in a way that's quick and achievable. So I will turn it over to Tom.
Thanks, Matt. All right, well, we'll start to dig into some of the school-related stuff. And again, we are continuing to dig a little deeper into these 4 areas that really make up the core of Septet. And as Matt said, some of these expand out into things like capable guardianship and so on. So if we go to the next slide, please. There we go. So what we have here is just, a little bit more around how Septet can touch with schools. So all schools have things like landscaping, fencing and walls, lighting. When schools are built or as they exist, they are part of the planning and zoning process at the local municipality, or they may have some interaction with the state Board of Education, or however your state is set up. A lot of the schools that I've worked with have had a lot of challenges with traffic. As I don't know if in your area, but we've had a number of schools that have closed, and as schools close, people are traveling, their kids are traveling further to schools, and so you have a lot more drop-offs and pickups, and a lot less bus transportation, and that brings with it a lot of challenges in the surrounding environment around the campus of the school. Even look at if you're building a school or development around the school. So schools, may be in proximity to other businesses, and they can help influence how those developments are built so that they enhance the safety versus potentially weaken the safety of the school. And looking at use of color, we'll show a couple slides in that. We won't get so much into parks, but there is a little bit that overlaps with the open spaces where children may be playing, and just general open spaces around the campus. It goes on and on. So we'll keep moving on to the next slide here. And what you'll see is that, we really look at two things. We look at how do people control access to a site, and how do we observe that site. And my slide's a little bit condensed here, but what we are looking at really is that we have, things like people, which would be the organized security. We have, mechanical. So this is anything that's really, manufactured or developed. So locks is one example, but fencing is also an example. And then natural, that would be the items that, as Matt had said, that, vegetation and other things that, we can put in place. And the same thing happens for the surveillance side. Next slide, please. There we go. And so really what we encourage, and this is for a number of reasons, is that primarily we look at the natural environment first and foremost because it's cheaper to address. It's much cheaper to trim a tree than it is to install cameras or fencing. And the same is said in other environments that we're looking at beyond schools. And then we kind of go into some of the secondary. And I like to think of this Septet as kind of like a recipe. Each recipe may be a little different, and we're seasoning it to the taste of what works best for our context. And so neither one of these completely solves problems, but they work in conjunction with each other. And it's in kind of an ebb and flow. It's looking at what can we do naturally, and then how do we enhance that or season that with secondary design concepts. Next slide, please. So another thing to think about with Septet, and then we'll look at some of the school stuff, is that, we want to make sure that all space has a designated purpose. Are there some ambiguities in some of the spaces on our school campuses? Have we defined how those things function? And have we designed it to support behaviors? So I always like this example of, this is probably a fast food place. And if you imagine going into a fast food place, and you get your food on a tray, and then you finish eating, and then you stand up and you realize there's no bus people, there's no waste receptacles, we're not really sure what to do. And then you start to look around, you realize that people are just leaving stuff everywhere. And so there are ways that we can design the environment that without blatantly telling people how they need to behave, it just naturally speaks to, oh, this is what we have to do in the space. We go over here, and this is where we put our stuff away. And so even thinking about those types of things. Next slide, please. And, finally, we want to think about, spaces. This is particular around probably the larger campuses. The normal users are the teachers, the parents, the administrators, and the students, and anybody else who, really belongs on the college or school campuses. The abnormal users are the people that we were trying to identify. And so often, when Septet is applied, you can identify pretty quickly if somebody is in a place and they're intending to do something that is out of step with what that place, is asking for. So, in a more extreme example, which we've seen, unfortunately, in our history is, with active shooters. I think of the last one with I think it was Uvalde. Somebody saw the person, kind of crossing the campus, and so they stuck out as an abnormal user. But if somebody was to come in, then it's a little bit more difficult if they're coming in through the, proper ways. And then we want to think about observers. So we want to make sure that there are ways that teachers, staff, everybody can observe, and that there's not impediments so that if people see something, they would say something. Next slide, please. And then just one more slide on kind of like some of the background here. This is environmental cues. And so if you think of this like investment, people that are looking to commit acts that are out of step with, what's acceptable in the school or any place are looking for good targets and bad targets, the same as we would if we were looking for a car or looking to invest in the stock market. They're looking at the environment and saying, okay, if I do something here, I'm definitely going to get caught. But if I do something over here, I may not be caught because the visibility is low, or there's low traffic, or there's no cameras, or a number of different things. And so we want to start looking at our schools and places in general as kind of role playing. If I was looking to commit someone to an offense, how do I feel about this hallway or this corridor or this bathroom, and so on. Next slide, please. So just real quickly, Septet looks, proactively, but also reactively to architecture. And so, oftentimes more and more we're finding that there are reviews on the pre-development side, looking at, well, if we put this stairway here, or if we put this here, what is that going to do for safety, or in terms of creating ambush points or visibility, and so on. And you can do that on the other side. A lot of our communities have older schools, and so that stuff is in place. And it's a bit more costly, of course, to do capital projects to address those issues. But then nonetheless, we do look at architecture. Next slide, please. And this is just, reinforcing that a lot of times there's ordinances. We're finding more and more in cities where they're having a Septet review, the same as they would a fire code review, building officials, and so on, looking at things in the site plans. Next slide. So here's a couple examples. One of the things that they did with these schools and these buildings is, allowing that you couldn't see behind the stairway. So eliminates ambush or concealment. And on the image on the right, they've created kind of a grading excuse me, so that, somebody couldn't reach through, but you can still see. Next slide. Here's an example of what we're seeing in some bathrooms. So, they're laying out the bathrooms so that the private areas, in the bathrooms remain private, but the areas near the sinks are visible, so that, if there was any type of bullying or other activity happening, it removes one part of the bathroom where that activity can happen unseen. Next slide, please. Another simple implementation is just putting a mirror. So if you were to walk in, you can see if somebody's hiding on the wall right, behind the entrance. And you can see if somebody is standing there waiting for someone to enter. Maybe there's somebody waiting for somebody and they're going to start a fight, or they're just hiding there doing something else. Next slide. So this is the new Sandy Hook School, and as you can see, there's a number of things that they've kind of deployed to make it so that there is good visibility. The trees that they picked will not grow in a way that are going to be, very thick and full. They have some level of transparency, lots of windows, different ways to move through the site. And if somebody was choosing a different way, they would, again, hopefully be identified as an abnormal user. And also the ways that they've designed kind of slows down the pathway. And then everything else is developed in a way that is, maintained well, and also the things that they've picked are maintainable, because sometimes that's what we see. You pick something very nice, and then maintenance kind of falls to the wayside. Next slide, please. Here's a couple of different other examples. So, the main pathway, which we call the celebrated entrance to the school in the upper corner, is almost kind of like the castle moat. Like if you saw somebody crossing in another way, they would really kind of stand out. You'd wonder why they're walking through all these rocks. And then, the one on the bottom corner is just the traditional use. We see these bollards. If you're not familiar with them, they're often cement, and often the same depth of cement is in the ground as is sticking up. And that's just to prevent vehicles and others from, passing through there and committing any type of incidents, whether it's intentional violence or, sometimes we see senior citizens or somebody who may have a medical issue, and they fall on the accelerator pedal and then end up driving through a building. Next slide, please. So here we see a school that we just recently had built here in Flint, Michigan, where I work. This is an early childhood center. And so, really clearly they've identified how to gain access to the site, created this celebrated entrance with lots of windows. The main office is right off the side, and they can see as people are coming in. And I don't think I have the image in here, but there's a breezeway, so that it also helps to control access and provide visibility. Next slide, please. And you can see here some of the fencing. So they've got a play area, and one of the things they've done, which you probably can't see as clearly because the fence is part of the whole picture, but they're using fencing that is anti-climb fencing. So it's very hard to get a foothold in there. And also because it doesn't have a top rail, it can be flexible. So it unsteadies the person if they were to try to climb over that. And again, you've got good visibility, and activities are located kind of away from the fence to provide maximum time if something was happening, and bringing things closer to the school so that people can address issues if there was a fight or some other type of incident. Next slide, please. So this is, just more of a humorous slide, but I do want to say that one of the best things you can do if you have issues, say with vandalism or people gaining access to the roof of the school, or just concerned about people gaining access into the school from windows, is to use what we call hostile vegetation. And that's really just things like there's, depending on your region, it could be cactus, it could be holly, it could be some type of thorny vegetation. And the idea is that it keeps people from getting too close to areas that you're trying to you don't want them to gain access to. And, in the case of, like spray painting or tagging, if you put that in there, it moves the person further away from the building, and that aerosol can't catch on the wall. And so the effectiveness of what they're trying to do is diminished. And so it's no longer a good target for, say, destruction of property. Next slide, please. So natural surveillance, one of the things that I noticed in some of the schools that I've looked at is that either they have older trees that are kind of planted near the windows and are blocking it, or as you see in some of this, you've got like posters and things hanging out there. And some schools, that don't have like flat screen TVs, they're using projection. It's understandable that they need some level of low light to be able to accurately project to the screen. But when they do that, they are, in the case of looking to see if there's anything happening on the campus, they're limiting their visibility by blocking those windows. And so we encourage schools to, often move to like a LED TV, which does not necessarily require that you have shades drawn or even putting shelves and other things up against those walls. Next slide, please. Here's two examples of schools, one that's doing it right and one that is missing the mark. The one that's doing it right, obviously the bike racks are near the entrance. They're safe. There's a short distance that the bicycle commuters have to travel to get into the school. On the other hand, you've got the bike rack on the back of the building, and you had to install camera systems because there were problems. And there's no visibility, and so there were fights and other things that would happen in the back of the space. And so thinking about where you locate the activities based on visibility is really important as well. Next slide, please. So this is just an example. This isn't a school, but this kind of shows really well how it all can be put together. So you've got low vegetation that reduces people's ability to hide behind stuff. You've got good fencing and entrance points to the playground. The tree canopy is at least 6 feet up starting, and good lighting and good visibility. And so, as we look at our schools, we want to think about where are the areas where we can't see, and is that where some of the issues that we're having, whether it's fighting or, any type of drug use or, whatever it might be. Next slide, please. Here's a actual example just that shows it really good. The tree canopy is up, and you notice that the windows, the visibility is good. Now, the other thing I want to point out is that you can't see in those windows, so there's a psychological deterrent here. You don't know if somebody's sitting behind there, and maybe they've got like a cafe style seating, and so the likelihood of something happening over here is slim because you don't know if you're being observed. And oftentimes, it's easier to see that you're not being observed if shades or curtains are drawn because you can see that fabric. But as you can see, the glare really prevents you from seeing inside. Next slide, please. This is another one of Sandy Hook. So you can see from the inside out, and you can see again how those trees really, the thin kind of branches. I know they're young, but they're not going to grow in super thick. And then the other image is just kind of an inside looking out of that early childhood education center in Flint and how you have good visibility there. Next slide, please. Another area to think about is libraries and media centers. And so here we have the kind of library media center in the upper corner. And one of the things that they did, which I really like, is that the shelves are arranged so that they're in line with these walls, and they're not prohibiting the view from the windows. If they were the other way, then the only time someone could see out those windows is if they are on the side between the window and the bookshelf. But now everybody has a clear view, and we're seeing this type of stuff in other places like grocery stores and other places now. It's starting to catch on. And the one on the lower corner, same. The shelves are lower so that they are not an impediment, and good visibility so that people can see out and be able to react if something was happening. Next slide, please. Decorations are popular in schools and it's in posters, and so I think this classroom does it right. That they've used stuff on the ceiling, that they've not added too many things on the windows to block them out, and that there's good visibility. You can see the playground out there, you can see parking, you can see a truck out there, and so they've really done a good job of placing things in a way that maximizes visibility for safety. Next slide. Maintenance is an issue with natural surveillance too. So some of us that have older schools, we may have some areas. I have a school that I usually have to reach out to every year because their level of maintenance reduces the surveillance. And you can see so much more after you've maintained the property. Next slide. Just really want to quickly hit on lighting. I know lighting is a popular thing, and I do want to say that if you have a on-site Septet assessment, there are lighting meters where, I've walked around campuses and looked at the light output at dusk and after dusk and early morning to see where it falls in terms of the recommendations from the International Illumination Society of North America. And I would say that there are some legal liabilities here. There are a couple cases that I'm aware of, not for schools, but where a crime occurred and the victim's family, the case that they built was around the lighting conditions and the light's inability to protect the victim. So we do want to think about lighting, and we want it to be able to deter activity that we don't want happening. We want to disable someone's ability to feel emboldened to commit certain acts or behaviors, and we want to be able to detect stuff. And the right lighting is also as important. So, we're more and more seeing LED lighting, and there are, good and bad things that we're finding around that. But what we are finding in terms of safety is that when things happen, if we have LED lighting, we're able to more accurately report what happened, more descriptive details. We're able to pinpoint the color of, someone's clothing or the vehicle or whatever happened. Whereas if you have the older lighting, the orange high pressure sodium lighting, you often can't accurately, you can say, well, it was dark. It was a dark car. I can't tell if it's brown, red, orange, purple, blue, whatever. So those things all have factors when we look at schools. Next slide, please. So, this is an example of a high school, and part of the value in this is that helping people move, the right people, I would say, move quickly to where they need to go and help them find things. This also helps with emergency responders, but building signage, landscaping, all these things really speak to, okay, you're on a campus. There are certain different things that are acceptable here, and there's things that are not acceptable. Next slide, please. Other examples of wayfinding: college campuses, some cultural areas. Some of these may not be as applicable to schools, but just kind of showing you different examples of how they can be utilized. Next slide, please. This is another new school. So this is this is called the Flint Cultural Center Academy. It's attached to our cultural center museums and student music and other groups. And it's a relatively new school, and so you can see that the lighting is good. You can see when you enter the campus that you're at a different place. Next slide, please. You can see they've got fencing to kind of delineate the public and semi-private and private space, and also to provide protection to the children. Next slide, please. Matt referenced some of the different ways where you can kind of use traffic calming or show that people are in different spaces. Schools are starting to adapt these raised crosswalks and other things that draw attention that you're in a school zone. It's I think maybe a better approach than a whole slew of signs that says, during these hours you travel at this speed, but during these hours, by the time you see that, or you're able to maybe read it, you're in the area and you haven't reacted quick enough. And so these things are much, I think, better in terms of helping protect kids, especially if you have a school where you have a lot of commuting by foot or bicycle. Next slide, please. Here's two other examples of, doing some traffic calming, but also kind of some showing ownership of the school. And so this one up in the upper corner is a school in Indiana where they had excess speeding near where the kids were exiting. And so they deployed some public art on the street. And the one on the bottom is just, beautifying a school that may have had more of a kind of a bland institutional feel. They've added some color and vibrancy, and that has an effect on kids. They in the color and just what they're approaching and how they act. Next slide, please. Again, thinking about lighting and how we light parking lots and athletic spaces. We want to be thinking about how that's utilized. Next slide. Landscaping, again, here's another good example at a school where they've got, shrubs that are not over, extending themselves and limiting visibility. They've built it into places for seating. So they've created places where now you have eyes in the area, and just a very inviting place versus kind of a sterile environment that you might pass through as you're going into the school. Next slide, please. Just a couple things about signage. So I like these signs because they're kind of playful. They're not super wordy. You have to think about how far and how long people are able to spend seeing signs. And so you want to think about, well, what's the most important thing to communicate? So these are a couple of good examples. And these tips about how you put the signs in are helpful as well. Next slide, please. Here's more traditional one about here's we're asking you to stop this way to visit the office, sign in, and so just clearly kind of communicating what you're expecting in a way that helps people move to and from place as quickly as possible. Next slide, please. Just a couple more things on maintenance. We want to make sure that when we engage in capital projects or any type of improvements that we have a maintenance plan. Oftentimes it's the last thing we think of because resources are scarce, but we do want to think about that because without a maintenance plan and without proper maintenance, these things kind of creep up and start to produce problems and invite behaviors and activity that we may not want to see. Some of the schools that I've worked with, we've had issues where people find those and then they become areas during the weekends where they become open air drug markets, or it's where people go park. There may be prostitution or just people engaged in sex acts and stuff. And so we want to be thinking about not just how the students may use the space in a good or a bad way, but after hours, what is this? What kind of environments does this create? Level of maintenance has a huge issue, or a huge factor in how the community would use the space. Next slide, please. And just thinking about, where we place landscaping. So, this is kind of a not as well maintained space. It's a little closed in. That growth, depending on what area of the country you're in, it could grow rapidly and be a problem. And so just thinking about like what's the best type of landscaping that's going to really not create a lot of maintenance issues. Next slide, please. This is an example of, so I worked for Kettering University in Flint. That's a STEM university, used to be General Motors Institute. And this is part of their campus as they were expanding. And this was also part of what we called the Flint River Trail. And very sketchy. No one wants to use this. And so one of the things that Kettering did was open this up. So if you look at the next slide, it's the same area, and you can now see that we're able to put a trail in, and you can see it leads to the stadium. If you go to the next slide, here's another angle from another entrance, and then you go to the next slide, and you can see the parking lot. So you don't know what you're going to stumble across. There were one time where I came down here a decade or more ago, and people were parked, engaged in certain acts and stuff. And so opening up, just taking out some trees that are overgrown, trimming them up can have a huge impact. And so now we see a lot of activity here that's good. You see a lot of runners and walkers and stuff. Next slide, please. This is also part of the trail, so you can obviously see this is overgrown. There's a van parked there. I don't know if somebody is living there, if it broke down, or if they're just kind of hanging out. But if you go to the next slide, you can see that that's been completely opened up. And one of the things that this is really important, about is kind of the concept of a 30-foot flight or fight rule. And so, I don't know how proven it is, but the kind of theory is that we have about 30 feet to determine if someone is friend or foe and how we're going to have to react. If you look, at the prior slides where there's no time to react, that's not a good situation. So now, depending on where you're at in your campus, if you have open sight lines and good maintenance, you're able to, assess the situation properly. So I just want to look at a couple of these slides. We'll move through most of them, and you'll have these, I think, provided to you after the webinar. But color has a huge impact. And so if you look at the next one, like yellow, it's fatiguing color. Studies have shown that babies cry more in yellow rooms. The couples fight more in the yellow kitchens. If you look at red, the next slide, if you have a lot of red in your classrooms, these are some of the things that we experience with red. Now you'll see a lot of our fast food restaurants use red, and you'll see that it says the sense of smell heightens, and so it's not it's well planned. I think that McDonald's and others are using red in their aesthetics. But if you look at blue, it relaxes people, lessens sweating, it eliminates the fight or flight response. So we'll skip through the rest of these, but these are just really helpful in thinking about how you design your schools, and some of the things that, sometimes depending on your school, it may be more costly to change the paint color, but it really depends on the size of your school, or if you're doing a classroom or a hallway. Here's a couple examples in restrooms. So we have a lot of damage in restrooms. I remember when I was growing up, where kids were tagging walls or kicking down stuff and trashing things. And this is an attempt to create nice places that really discourage people from wanting to damage these. They're less sterile environments. So we can just flip through these slides. You can kind of see, encouraging messages, different types of public art, Marvel superheroes, different themes and stuff. So I think you probably get the idea here. But they're very different than the restrooms that I think I remember when I was in school. So now we get to the kind of the meat of the Septet. So you're doing an assessment. Hopefully you've got, maybe it's a law enforcement partnership, or you've got somebody who is kind of working with law enforcement on your campus, so you can get any type of crime data for the surrounding area if you want to go that far. I would say for schools, you would want to look at the data and say, like, what's our incident data? What kind of incidents are we having inside? It may not necessarily be criminal, but it nonetheless is, you're going to know how to find that data. And then just looking at, well, who makes up the school, or who makes up the community, and if you're having issues around the school, what's around the school? Do we have like liquor stores, or do we have other things that are contributing? Do we have a lot of vacant housing? And then the best thing is to really walk the area and observe, and talk to people, talk to students, talk to staff. Talk to residents or people around the community if you're going out beyond your school campus. Next slide, please. And you want to think about these different things, like the types of things that students are encountering between home and school. That's why we have Safe Routes to Schools programs and other programs happening. And what's our visibility look like for visitors, and do we have the ability to prevent visitors from entering? So like my school district, they put in different measures where you can't get too far in the school, like once you're buzzed in. Next slide, please. And also, can we see what's going on in the school? And so some schools don't have a lot of windows, and unfortunately that's a huge capital expense to add windows. But I've seen some schools that you would think they are juvenile detention centers or prisons, because they really have a kind of like a very sterile environment, and you can't see what's happening in the school. And so that can also be a risk, if you can't see in there. Next slide, please. So just a couple examples real quickly of and then we'll close this out. I was on a project, I believe it was a National Institute of Justice or National Institute of Health funded research project with the University of Michigan and Michigan State University. And it was a project where there was 3 different areas. There was a Septet component, restorative practices, and a crisis mental health component. And I was on the Septet side. So we assessed about a dozen schools. We looked at, all of these different things that Matt and I have been talking about. And, here's a couple things that I think were pretty common that, you may find in your schools if you start looking around, is that, most schools have already kind of done some of this stuff. They didn't know what Septet is, or maybe they did, but not to some extent, but they've been implementing it. That it's very subjective, really. Each school determines kind of how and what it implements. If you've got a 150-year-old building, it's going to be very hard to make some modifications when it's got a certain type of architecture. Maybe it's a historic structure versus a new building, or depending on kind of how things are laid out. But really everybody wants to mitigate risks and unhealthy behaviors. And we don't want to create, more work. We want, more enriching environments for students. And this goes, from urban to rural. There's really no universal model. Some of these things that you may find may require subject matter experts. We had some schools where, again, I mentioned a lot of the cars, the pickup drop off, and so you've got kids that are now entering busy streets and getting in cars, and so you need to probably engage with traffic engineers and others. But in other strategies you may not need to. Maybe just trimming down some bushes, or replacing some lights with different types of light fixtures. I was really surprised a lot of how similar the schools were, though. They were very concerned about protecting against outside threats. Small things like some of the lights, kids could turn the lights on and off because they didn't have kind of that key switch, or some type of switch that administrators would have, or your support staff. Things like adding visitor badges so that they could identify. You could, in some of the schools, I could be walking through the school and no one would stop me and ask me what I was doing. And so, that was a little bit concerning. Thinking about, even little things like signage and, highlighting the entryways. You may find that how to get into the school, but you may find that others, you can't tell, one or two entrances from each other. They don't know which entrance they go to. There may be two parking lots, and they don't know if one's a parking lot for guests, and it's because it's closer to the main entrance. And so just thinking about signage and how the campuses are, laid out, even if you're, thinking about if your campus, your school is connected to other schools, maybe it's adjacent to a junior high or a middle school or a high school, or early childhood, and how those things flow to and from. I was thinking about the colors. Many of the schools that I went into use kind of like that. I call it like prison green, where it's you can't tell if it's green or blue, but it kind of hurts your eyes if you look at it. But it's very kind of dingy. And just thinking about how you can add color and change the environment. Some schools that I was in, they ran out of space, and so they were storing things, and so now there were like hallways where they were half as wide because they had desks and other things in the way, or people didn't have enough offices, and so they were using desks in the hallways as offices, and thinking about how that lays out. There were some where it's like they had instituted camera systems, but they had turned the TV off because it was too distracting, or a camera was flickering and agitating the person. So just wrapping it up here for the next slide. One of the things we want to think about. So we've done the assessment. We'll slide right before this. Oh, I guess maybe it's taken out. Oh, that's okay. We can stay on that one. The next slide. There we go. So Septet implementation, it can be pretty low cost, and it can be pretty high cost, and it's really subjective. And so, a lot of the factors, and so you've done a Septet assessment. It's really up to the school, the staff, the decision makers to determine what's feasible. If there's a kind of a sequencing, they decide what they want to do. I often think of Septet assessments, very similar to house assessments when you're buying a home and you have a home inspector. Sometimes there are things that they find that are high priority, but they're also high cost, and so you may not be able to do those. And sometimes there are things that are low cost and you may be able to do several of those, but they're not indicating, with, some level of certainty that you must do, these three things. It's really up to the homeowner, and the same is true for the school and the district. So it may be, something as low as kind of changing the layout of spaces, or painting, or adding signage. One school added, labels to outside doors because they had like 20 or something doors, and if they had a emergency situation, responders weren't going to be able to know like which door to go to most appropriately respond to that. And then on the other end, it's like you have things like Sandy Hook, where oftentimes it's a new school, or projects that require permits from the city, or the state, or technology. And so it's really about kind of looking at what do we have, what do we want to tackle first, how do we want to see what that does, and that may impact the next thing that we do or do not implement. And those factors, cost, the scale, how much time do we have? Is this something we identified, but summer's almost over and we've got 30 days, but it's going to take more than 30 days to implement this? Do we have scheduling issues? Do we need to find partners to work with us on this, and so on? So the last slide here, I use this everywhere. Again, it's not the total answer to community problems, but it does provide the community with the means to eliminate or reduce environmental obstacles. And again, we're looking at social, cultural, and managerial issues that we want to address. So that's my last slide. Hand it back to Matt and James.
All right. I think we have time for questions. I don't know if anybody wants to raise their hand. I don't see anything in the chat or in the Q&A right now. One thing I'd like to highlight, after Tom's discussion is perceptions of safety in a space are going to vary quite a bit among individuals. So when we're looking at making changes to space, it's important that we get the input and suggestions from lots of different people, as many people, and in the school context that includes students.
Yeah, and it can be even something that's not necessarily like what you would immediately think of as safety issue. So like one school I was in, they had kids that maybe had behavioral, social challenges, and they would bolt out of the classroom and they would find a place to hide, whether it was a locker or in an alcove. And, that's not necessarily like outright a safety issue, but the fact that now somebody has to deal with that, then you're away from the class, or then you have other issues that could be, safety related. And so there's all kinds of different behaviors that I think we can be looking at. But again, like you said, bringing in people who are using the space.
Right, and it can be really important. It's critical to bring in the community around you, because when we talk about behaviors that make us feel unsafe or that are worrisome, oftentimes that's perfectly legal behavior. One thing to think about is groups congregating on a corner, right? If they're not drinking or actively using drugs, it's usually perfectly legal activity. But can make us feel comfortable if it's happening at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night outside our house. So we want to make sure when we're developing strategies to address these behaviors that make us feel uncomfortable, that we're getting the input and getting the cooperation of community members so they don't end up feeling targeted by the strategies that are meant to make everybody feel safer.
Yeah, and on that end, Tom, think about kind of cultural competency too. Schools are often kind of like a home base for community. They're used in so many different ways to engage residents. How can we think about making sure that residents, immigrant populations, folks that are not native English speakers, how do they participate in this type of work?
Yeah, a couple thoughts just come to mind off the top of my head. That this can be this can be a slow process or whatever pace you want. So I often encourage not necessarily setting a hard timeline unless you're up against something, because you're always going to encounter somebody who wasn't engaged and wants to be engaged and may have some really great feedback. The others is thinking about those things like language, or just similar as we think about in education, about some people are more apt to learn by reading or seeing or hearing. And so what are the different ways that we can communicate with the community that they may see? Maybe it's the school has a YouTube channel or a TikTok or something, or maybe it's a newsletter. And like, I don't read the newsletters much in my school for my kids, but I do see the social media posts, which often restate what's going on. And so I think thinking of the different avenues, and trying to have good representation, to think about that, like, what about who's using the space, or what do we, what might we want to use the space for? Is the space not being utilized? Some of our schools in Flint now offer things like senior citizen dance classes, and have some building trades type of stuff. And so you have other people that may come to your schools in the future. So thinking about kind of looking at some of the long-term strategic plans and hopes of the school.
Perfect. I just put a couple of resources in the chat. There's a Septet assessment that the CDC utilizes. If you click on the link, I believe there's a Septet form as you dive a little bit deeper into that web page. I think, Tom, you had indicated that you have a couple of assessments that you've helped with schools. Tom's going to be one of our subject matter experts. So if you have Septet questions, we'll definitely be happy to connect you to him, and his assessments will make sure that we put on the CYVP resource page, which I've also linked as well. Does anybody have any questions? You can either raise your hand, put it in the chat, or come off mute, perhaps, if you're able to do that. All right, everybody seems fairly quiet today. Matt, do you have any other questions or any other final thoughts, Tom, that you want to provide?
I just would say, and this is kind of based on a conversation I was having on some other stuff that I was working with LISC on, that there's a kind of a bookend between safe spaces and then what we call placemaking, places that are engaging. And oftentimes we may want enhancements, but we have these issues. And so Septet is an amazing tool because of the different ways you can deploy resources, and how you can kind of decide what level of resources you want to deploy. If you want your school to be at a certain state, oftentimes looking at it from a safety perspective first opens up possibilities for other types of enhancements, whether it's programmatic or additional uses, which we would kind of factor in that placemaking side of things. And so just another thing to think about with the school safety.
Yeah, and just reiterating the power of partnership and bringing community into both looking at how you use a space, taking care of and maintaining a space, and also if you're looking to make quick Septet changes, right? Bringing community members in as a way to have events that create those changes, potentially in a cheaper, quicker, lighter, borrowing Tom's phraseology for some other work, lighter, quicker, cheaper work, bringing the community and making it into an event and a way to come together.
Yeah, we've had ways to engage kids in that. One of the schools we worked in had about 600 kids that participated, and they identified interesting safety things that were also place-based. They said that they often saw people driving through the campus to park closer to the playgrounds, and that was in part because some of the fencing and bollards that were on the perimeter were no longer there, and so they felt unsafe that somebody could enter the campus with a vehicle at any time. But then the placemaking side, they saw, that there were not sufficient number of waste receptacles. And so, the school was very frustrated with the amount of litter, and the students, astutely pointed out, well, everybody's using the trash cans, but they're filling up way too fast. We have too few of them, and maybe they're not getting emptied fast enough. And so engaging the kids is one way, I think. I do see the other question about the windows. I think that's something I'm going to dig into. I'm part of a couple Septet networks nationally and internationally, and so I think there may be some studies or some people that are more have some more. They've been more involved in that. I've not been part of that, so I can look into that and see relative to the bathroom windows. What that ended up doing, whether it was a modification. And I'll pass that along to Matt and James to share.
All right. Any last questions? Otherwise, we appreciate your all's time. Again, when we'll be posting this recording as well as the PowerPoint deck on our CYVB resource page, probably next week. And if you have any questions about Septet, don't hesitate to email me, Matt, or LeVar, and we'll make sure that they get connected to Tom. All right, have a fantastic rest of your day. We'll be in touch.
Thanks, everybody.